He was one of the survivors that boarded the ship and made their way to safety. Taylor's 1876 account of the combat is regarded as one of the most thorough and accurate accounts of the conflict. Historians have examined it extensively, and it remains a crucial primary source on the Battle of Little Bighorn. William Oliver Taylor was a private in the 7th Cavalry Regiment's Company A during his time in the U.S. Army. He is famous for having survived the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where a force of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes routed the 7th Cavalry Regiment. Taylor was one of the few soldiers who made it off the battlefield and returned to the river, where the steamer Far West eventually came to his aid. Please support our community by and subscribing to our channel before we start. The march on June 24, 1876, had been quite exhausting since we had stopped several times to give the scouts time to thoroughly reconnoiter the valley in front of us. The guys spread their shelter tents and blankets on the ground and lay down for a much-needed rest after our horses had been fed and tamed and our basic meal of coffee and hardtack had been finished. The location of our bivouac was one of the most picturesque we had ever seen. To our right was a tall bluff that was nearly perpendicular for a short time, between which a cool, clear brook flowed in the river and a level grassy plateau that was about 200 yards wide. The park-like landscape was enhanced by the abundance of wild rose bushes in full bloom and the occasional trees scattered around this plateau. With its low willows and aromatic rose bushes, it was simple to understand why the river got its name. It was such a suitable location for a camp that Custer frequently chose one of exceptional natural beauty whenever he could. Therefore, it felt appropriate that the location of what would end up being the final camp for so many people should be so lovely. Since then, I frequently hoped that the location may be found and a picture taken. My troop was positioned very close to Custer's headquarters, alone a tent to continue. Prior to this, he sat for a long time by himself, seemingly absorbed in solitude. As I lay on my side facing him, I noticed that his face had a sorrowful expression that I had never seen before, possibly due to the encroaching dusk. Did he think about Fort Lincoln, where he had abandoned his cherished wife, in his distant thoughts? Was there a sense of dread in his heart about what was ahead tomorrow? However, a number of officers gathered at his tent for specific instructions, quickly interrupting his meditation. A few younger officers paused close to one of their fellow officers' bivouac as the council dispersed. Shortly after, I heard Annie Laurie's words, which came in a slow, melancholy rhythm, followed by tiny, delicate footfall. The farewell at the door follows. The doxology is the last one. Give thanks to God, the source of all blessings. On an Indian road, cavalrymen would sing a fairly unique tune, did it not? Several of those young officers had just left West Point. Was it not a prayer from their hearts? As the final words drifted away, they appeared to shake off their melancholy feelings, adding, "Because he's a jolly good fellow that nobody can deny." This may or may not have been the result of an intuitive premonition of the sad outcome that awaited many of them. At the time, I thought it was a really disrespectful sentiment. However, religious awe is not a trait that soldiers usually possess. After sharing a few pleasant evenings, they went to bed. The camp was unusually quiet, only sometimes disturbed by the sound of a nightbird calling or a horse trampling. As we lay there in that serene and beautiful bivouac, in an area of the Indians' paradise that we had never visited before, how could anyone imagine that only a week earlier, a bloody battle had raged just a short distance above us, when Crazy Horse repulsed General Crook's advance with a force far superior to our own? Not even the most vivid imagination could have predicted that, within a month, the same enemy forces we were then chasing, emboldened by another and even bigger victory, would once more be camped on this very stream, only to be quickly scattered by General Terry's approach from the north, taking the same route we had just blazed, in General Crook's second arrival coming down the river from the south. Within a few miles of our camp, the valiant and unconquered lame deer would soon give his life for the right to live and hunt along this rose-bordered stream, and his name would be immortalized in the annals of his tribe in the years to come. Our command would encircle a large portion of the country, only to return here and pursue the same hostile force we now sought. There we were only able to relax for a few hours. We were roused and told to mount for a night march at around 10 o'clock. Soon after, we mounted the saddle and marched for at least 10 miles up the divide, which separated the Rosebud from the small Bighorn, while continuing to follow the Rosebud along the North Fork of the river. We stopped at around 2 in the morning to await word from the scouts who had been dispatched to find the Indians' camp, if possible. Many of the soldiers took advantage of the opportunity to slumber when the saddles were taken off. Coffee was prepared as daylight arrived, but the water quality was subpar and difficult to drink. People who didn't want to sleep gathered in small groups to talk about the possibility of a fight and to pull away from the constant pipe. A little before 8 o'clock, General Custer returned from the point on the divide where the scouts had seen the smoke rising from the Indian village and the pony herds grazing in the valley nearby at a distance of about 12 or 15 miles. He rode bareback, and I believe bareheaded, around to the various troops, informing the officers that the Indians had been located and stating that the command would move immediately. As soon as the men saddled up, we started up the divide between the Rosebud and Little Bighorn rivers. We didn't stop until around 10:30 a.m., when we stopped in a ravine, possibly 4 or 5 miles from the divide's crest. Here we were instructed to remain hidden and to maintain silence. Captain Godfrey states that although Custer had stated that he would not assault until the following morning, our presence had been detected. Therefore, the scouts and others indicated that immediate action was required. Just before noon, we began crossing the divide once more. Soon after, the regiment was split up into battalions. Major Reno commanded the advance battalion, which was made up of Lieutenants McIntosh and Wallace in Troop G, Captain French in Troop M, and Captain Moylan and Lieutenant DeRudio in Troop A. In addition, there were 30 Indian scouts led by Lieutenants Varnum and Hare, accompanied by 2 interpreters, a half-breed named Frank Gerard and a colored man named Isaiah Dorman. The unit also had 3 white scouts, Baron Dott, George Herendine, and Charlie Reynolds. The detachment also included 2 medical personnel, doctors, Porter and DeWolf. Although the precise size of the battalion is uncertain, it was probably somewhat under 150 in total. General Custer, with Troops C, E, F, J, and L, was on our right, while Captain Benton's battalion, with Troops D, H, and K, totaling about 125 men, pushed off to our left front. Bringing up the rear were the pack trains, escorted by B Troop and Captain McDougal. Following the Indian Trail, Major Reno's brigade advanced down a valley that was traversed by Benton's, also known as Sundance Creek, a stream that, when it was wet, drained into the small Bighorn River. At the moment, however, the stream was dry. Our Indian scouts had lit a burial teepee with a warrior's body ablaze when we passed it on our march. Our Indian scouts had burned the body of a warrior. The corpse was later identified as the brother of Circling Bear, also called Old She-Bear, who had died 8 days earlier on June 17th in the battle with Crook on the Rosebud. Personally, I did not see any Indians, despite reports that some were seen nearby, maintaining a safe distance ahead. We soon reached the Little Bighorn, a stream that is between 50 and 70 feet broad and 2 to 4 feet deep, with pristine icy cold water. Reno gave us an order as we got closer to the river, which caused us to accelerate. Both our horses and their riders immediately dived into the river to quench their thirst. I took off my hat, turned the brim into a scoop, and leaned over to fill it with water while I waited for the horses to finish drinking. I drank the last drop of water I would have for more than 24 hours. We dismounted and tightened our saddle girths after riding the horses out of the river and through the underbrush and onto the prairie. We were traveling down a long, narrow valley in roughly 10 minutes. On our right was the river's winding, densely forested course, which was bounded by tall bluffs. Low hillsides rose to our left, from which we could see some of the pony herds. As we got closer, we could make out mounted men moving in various directions, some in circles and others moving back and forth. We were walking at a fast pace when they started to gather their ponies and make signals. Later we were told to trot, and then we heard the distinct ping of bullets and faint puffs of smoke. Major Marcus Reno gave the order to charge, and some of our men started cheering in response to the Indians' war whoops. But then Major Reno yelled, "Stop that noise!" And then the order charge rang out again. It sounded like charge to me, and it came in a tone that made me turn my head and look back. A short way behind my company came Lieutenant Hodgson and the Major, who were riding side by side. Major Reno had just brought a bottle to his lips when I turned to look behind him. After that, he gave it to Lieutenant Hodgson. The flask was perhaps half or two-thirds full of an amber-colored liquid and looked to be the size of a rope. This situation wasn't out of the ordinary, but it will always be ingrained in my memory. I couldn't help but worry what was in the flask and how it would affect our leadership as I returned my focus to the front. I've always had a strong feeling about what it might have been, but I can't say for sure. Notably, our Indian adversaries subsequently claimed that our soldiers had been acting intoxicated during the conflict, and one Cheyenne warrior even claimed to have discovered whiskey on the corpses of our slain soldiers. In any event, I was in a less than optimal position as we were ready to fight the enemy. I had to lead 3 horses into battle as the 4th man in the count-off, which prevented me from going straight into the fray. Fortunately, my attempt to switch positions with Cornelius Crowley, my number 3 man, was unsuccessful. Crowley had been displaying symptoms of mental instability, which the battle's tension only made worse. Later, the stable guard kept a tight eye on him. With large cottonwood trees and thick underbrush on either side, the river meandered through the prairie as we rode in the direction of the Indian hamlet. Without hesitation, we rode across the rugged terrain, our horses propelling us quickly into the unknown. Many resolute, set faces can be seen along the line. Some may appear slightly pale, but not all of them are filled with fear. The angel of death was quite close. Was he placing his seal on people who would be dead, nude, and nearly unrecognizable after an hour on the plains or in the woods? But whatever the case, nobody flinched. For the majority of us, it was our first actual close-quarters combat. It was a bit difficult to sit up as a human target, to be shot at and not return the fire, and our baptism of fire was a novel and unusual experience. But our turn was coming. Holt gave the swift, precise order, got ready for battle on foot, and immediately followed. While the other men dismounted, tied their horses together, gave the number 4 man the bridle reins, and leaped forward to their positions in the skirmish line, the 4th man from the right stayed in his saddle. Looking back, it seems like madness that 150 cavalrymen would charge with a cheer down on an Indian village that had at least 2,500 Sioux warriors. When they were close, they dismounted to fight on foot, leaving a quarter of their numbers to hold the horses. After 150 men charged into an 1,800 lodge settlement, the lead horses, led by Lieutenant Hare, were moved into the woods for more protection, staying just behind the skirmish line. I'm not sure how long we stayed there, but I can't imagine it being more than 15 or 20 minutes at most. I don't remember hearing any orders about what we were to do, and I didn't see Major Reno while we were in the woods. There was a lot of noise and several rounds whistled through the brush. The skirmishers suddenly rushed into the woods in search of their horses, which they first were unable to find due to the underbrush and a little shift in position. Then I heard someone remark, "We need to leave quickly." When the 1st and 2nd of my foursome noticed me, they immediately took their horses away, leaving me with Crowley's horse and me wondering where he was. I immediately chased after him, asking, "Where's my horse?" as I rushed around. "My horse is where?" He rushed at me, so I yelled at him, possibly not courteously, but successfully. I turned my horse toward the direction I had saw the men heading and tossed him the bridle rein. I dismounted twice and then mounted again, while everyone was in complete disarray. All in a short while. However, why? I'm not sure, unless I observed the others doing it and assumed they were following directions. As I only went a short distance, I looked to my left and back and hoped to spot a sizable number of Indian horses racing through the forest in the same general direction as us, apparently trying to catch the guys who had come before me. I thought they were our Indian scouts at first, but a second look convinced me otherwise. These Indians were mostly dressed in their combat gear, which included a gun in hand, a whip hanging from their wrist, and only a breech clout and a feather. A sturdy-looking person, the closest of all, was one conspicuous exception. He had a gorgeous war bonnet with long feathers that encircled his head and trailed down his back, the end of which fluttered with his pony. I was inclined to fire at him, but my poor marksmanship and the thick tree cover prevented me from doing so. Furthermore, my comrade appeared committed to a quick departure, so I spared his life. Ever since, I have often wondered if that man might not have been one of the noble, large chiefs, Gaul or Black Moon. As I continued, I discovered that the underbrush was extremely dense, and as I forced my way through, my right stirrup became tangled. The strap holding it to the saddle almost tore it asunder, making it useless. As a result, I had to take extra care to keep my balance. I left the woods in much less time than it takes to narrate this, and I emerged onto the prairie, a short distance from where we first entered the woods. The sight before me was utterly depressing. Only 200 yards away, a huge and steadily growing group of Indian warriors were racing toward us, with all the haste they deserved, their ponies running full speed. This whooping, howling horde of skilled horsemen and fierce fighters, the most powerful in our country or any other, had outflanked our left and cut off our path back to the ford where we had first crossed the river. Now the closest of them fired a fierce and terrifying salvo from the other side of their mounts. To my left, a group of fellow soldiers was hurrying east toward the bluffs, which were between half and three-fourths of a mile away. The river flowed at the base of the cliffs, with steep, precipitous slopes that were encircled by dense underbrush. The situation was really serious, and I was dumbfounded by its suddenness and severity. But just minutes before, we were easily displacing the Indians. We had no time for reflection now that we were on the defense. Every man in front of me had his right arm extended, shooting a revolver at a line of shouting Indians, and I quickly did the same. The English thin red line was more than just a faint recollection. A dense crimson line of Sioux warriors was forming here, and it was getting thicker every minute. Hundreds more appeared out of the dust clouds, ready to jump in and shout and run toward a soldier. The majority of them were fighting for the first time, and many of them, like me, had never fired a shot from horseback. I attempted to fire at an Indian directly across from me, who appeared to be paying particular attention to me, despite the fact that my right steer up was rendered useless, compromising my seat and aim. In the heat of the moment, a lot of thoughts were racing through my head, and I saved one of the 6 bullets in my revolver for a last resort, intending to use it on myself if necessary. However, circumstance had other ideas. My nervousness was heightened by the persistent fear that my horse would stumble and toss me to the ground as we flew through a prairie dog settlement, which had many holes and mounds that made for a perilous ride at our rapid speed. After a few moments of this terrifying experience, I decided it would be foolish to dismount and look for my weapon in the tall grass. So I hurried towards the river, where a chaotic scene unfolded before me. As I steadied myself, my right hand, still holding my revolver, instinctively reached for the pommel of my saddle, and my revolver slipped from my grasp and fell to the ground. The Indians were closing in, intending to drive us into the river and drown us. The ancient riverbed was about 3 or 4 feet lower than the surrounding terrain, with a precipitous bank that my horse passed over with a slight jump. Blood stained the river as a struggling mass of men and animals flailed around. I heard Lieutenant Hodgson scream in agony as he was tortured, and I knew he was one of them. I quickly found myself on the other side of the river after steering my horse to the right to avoid the chaos. After a long struggle, I was able to climb the steep bank, but my weary horse, Steamboat, would not go any farther. The poor creature, which was already broken-winded and condemned, had suffered from the fast pace and exertion. He had been given to me since there weren't enough mounts, and he had gained notoriety for making an odd whistling sound when he moved. Bullets whistled about me as I dismounted, and I froze for a short while so Steamboat could collect his breath. Then I tried to guide him forward, but he wouldn't go. I poked him with my carbine in frustration, but to no effect. As they led their horses over the top of the cliff, my fellow soldiers hurried by me, some on horseback and some on foot. Being dismounted in front of hundreds of Sioux warriors was like staring into a void, making the seriousness of our predicament abundantly clear. I kicked Steamboat goodbye in a fit of rage and disgust, unslung my carbine, and started climbing the bluff, leaving our pursuers' weapons in my path. We were climbing a funnel-shaped mountain that was narrow at the summit and had deep ravines on each side that ended close to the river. There was no other place in the area where we could have done such a quick and comparatively smooth climb, so it seemed as though Providence had led us here. Maybe a third of the way up, I was passed by Myers, a dismounted comrade who was known as Tinkerbill because he had worked as a tanner's apprentice prior to enlisting. After a short while of walking together, Myers simply yelled, "Oh!" and fell forward, face down, on the ground. Unfortunately, he was dead, shot between the left ear and the eye when I leaned over him. I worried that I may be the next. So instead of going straight ahead, I took a right turn into the ravine, then a left turn again, moving up the slope in a zigzag fashion. Frank Neely, an old comrade from M Troop, was mounted and guiding a horse at the top, and he passed me. He kindly offered me the horse, which I took with gratitude, relieved to be back in the saddle. I was grateful to have a horse beneath me, even though my new mount, Old Dutch, was not much better than the one I had before. At the top of the bluff, I continued riding and joined Reno's main command group. A few others who had just barely escaped soon joined us. I had previously pondered what a man would experience when confronted with death. I knew now. As we rode across the valley and over the bluffs, a howling mass of red warriors, motivated by adornment and a desperation to preserve their families, followed us. Given the overwhelming number of Indians in our own unorganized state, our escape was nothing short of miraculous. They looked like fiends to us, but were they really that way? The Indian fire and pursuit suddenly stopped as we ascended the bluffs, for which we were really thankful, even though we didn't fully understand why. Major Reno appeared strange and military as he paced around in a frenzied manner, his hat missing in the confusion, and a red handkerchief tied around his head. The men had flung themselves to the ground, weary. Our break was short-lived as the officers gathered and exchanged stories about the fight. Captain Benteen soon arrived with troops HD and K, who had been sent to the left 2 hours earlier. Following both verbal and written instructions, they were en route to join Custer. According to Reno's own recording, this reunion with his command took place at 2:30 p.m. After receiving orders from Custer to hurry and join him, Captain McDougal arrived shortly after with B Troop, escorting the pack train. The message had been brought to McDougal by Sergeant David C. Knipe of Captain Tom Custer's unit. C, notably, the general had been riding with his younger brother, Boston Custer, who was working as a civilian forage master that morning. On his way to rejoin the command after returning to the pack train for a new horse, he ran upon Trumpeter Martin, who was bearing a message for Captain Benteen. After exchanging remarks, they each went their separate ways. Before the combat started, Boston Custer returned to the command, and his body was eventually discovered next to his two brothers. After Captain Benteen's command arrived, we stood on the bluff for more than 2 hours, unopposed and motionless. Reno's 3 troops' first sergeants tallied the men in attendance, taking into consideration those who had been killed, injured, or gone missing, as well as any lost government property. In the direction Custer was thought to have gone, we had heard firing in the distance. A common inquiry was, why don't we move? Even though the 3 soldiers fighting in the valley were a little disheartened, this did not mean that the entire command should sit around doing nothing. Although some of our guys had sustained injuries, none were so serious as to prevent them from riding with the group train. Since Custer hadn't had time to move far, all of the officers must have known that he was fighting the Indians nearby. There was only one possible explanation for the abrupt departure of the powerful Indian force that had forced us from their camp. Another genuine or promised attack from a different direction on their camp. A group of 12 fellow soldiers was observed climbing the bluffs at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon. When the command withdrew, others had dismounted in the woods or just outside and had stayed hidden until it appeared that the Indians had left the area. Then they came out and started walking toward the path Reno had followed. The company started off with 14 members, but 2 of them chose not to try to flee during the day and stayed behind, only to be found and then slaughtered by the Indians. George Herondine, a scout, 6 troops from G Troop, 3 from M Troop, and 2 from a troop made up the group that was able to flee. Only 5 Indians were encountered along the way, and they were easily driven back without suffering any casualties. One of the A Troop men found my horse grazing peacefully where I had left him after he had crossed the waist-deep river. He assumed I had died, so he brought the horse with him and then gave him back to me. Nothing was missing from my personal items or equipment. I should note that another group of our soldiers had also stayed in the woods, unknown to the first party, even though the horse had been approaching the Indian line for almost 33 hours. Lieutenant DeRudio, Private Tom O'Neill of G Troop, Frank Gerard, the Rees translator, scouts, and half-breed scout William Jackson made up the second party. These four guys arrived at our lines late on the evening of the 26th, after a period of roughly 34 hours and multiple near misses, bringing the total number of troops known to have been abandoned during the charge to 18. There were probably other men who were unable to flee. We were told to fall in at around 5 o'clock after the group of 12 joined us, and we mounted our horses and rode off in the direction that Custer was thought to have traveled. We arrived at a ridge that provided a partial view of what would subsequently be known as Custer's battlefield after a quick ride around the bluffs that blocked our view of the Indian village. Many Indians were visible to us in the distance, while some were nearby. They soon started moving in our direction, and our advanced troops, led by the captain, were attacked. After that, we were told to retire as a command, and we went back to where we had been. By this point, we were totally encircled by the Indians, and they opened fire on us. The men positioned themselves on the ridges, lying near the ground, while the crowded train, injured men, and horses were positioned in a depression between two ridges. In accordance with Major Reno's account, I think this happened at approximately 6 p.m. Godfrey, captain, implies that it might have been a little later, but he must be wrong because, with the Sioux closing in and their strength now commanding our highest regard, it would not have been possible for us to go just a mile, fight, and return to our starting point in 2 hours. A valley that provided some cover for our horses and injured was created by two large ridges that sloped back towards the east from the sheer bluffs that faced the river. The day had been extremely demanding and dangerous, leaving even the most seasoned veterans and new recruits pale-cheeked. In hindsight, it is astounding that the large Indian force, which had so quickly destroyed Custer and his 5 troops, did not press their advantage and pursue us with equal vigor. Despite the fact that this position was constantly exposed to long-range fire from the east, those in charge of keeping the horses lay as flat as possible, fervently hoping for nightfall. Thankfully, they paused, and although they continued to fire until dusk, they finally stopped at around 9 o'clock in the evening. Captain Godfrey said we suffered relatively few casualties. Only 3 deaths and a few more injuries were reported to me. Scouts were sent out after dark to look for indications of Custer's troops, but they quickly returned and said there were a lot of Indians in the area. Then, from a neighboring eminence, a trumpeter was instructed to blast a variety of sounds in the hopes of reaching Custer's command and directing them to our position. The trumpeter blew 3 or 4 calls with all of his strength, facing the direction Custer had taken. The final call, as I remember it, was taps, which is usually performed after tattoo to extinguish lights and is also played before a soldier's burial. Did the trumpeter's decision to play taps on that quiet night happen by accident, or was there a deeper motive? A deep sense of sadness descended upon our hearts as the echoes vanished into the night. The recently dug shallow graves of other troops who had fallen that afternoon were close by, quickly buried by their fellows. Just a basic trench in a thin layer of earth, exposed to the next rainstorm, with no ceremony. To be continued.